All right, in this presentation, we're going to take a look at a brief history of the business of substance use disorder treatment or addiction treatment in America. Who is this video for? It's really meant for private equity firms, investment bankers, investors, maybe people and professionals already involved in the space that are just curious on the evolution of the business model over time from free to very high dollar top 1% individuals going into expensive nonprofit treatment to the for-profit models that evolve, and then the environment that we have today in a very saturated, very ultra competitive market. By understanding the evolution of the space, I hope to be able to help people just understand the context in which different programs operated, why we have legacy providers, and some of the largest providers in the country are struggling to survive and be fiscally sustainable versus 8 years ago when they were making money hands over fists. And then additionally, we're going to take a look at some of the clinical evolutions that has happened and how that's impacted the business model, what's going on in terms of getting patients access to quality care, to understand these different pieces for those that want to start an SUD or treatment facility business today. How can you do it right? How can you work in the macro environment and the existing reimbursement, the regulatory context, the competitive environment, and how do we avoid some of the mistakes of the past? Also, how do some of the mistakes of the past, of which there were very, very many within substance use disorder treatment, so that we are positioning ourselves to be a provider of choice and a quality provider, because there is a tainted history in the space that we need to be aware of in order to successfully navigate and build relationships and position ourselves within communities that we serve. So starting off, we have what I would consider to be the pre-parity phase. There was a lot that happened pre-parity, which is really pre-2008. So I'm not going to go over the entire history there. It's just not relevant to today's business environment. But in short, early on in America, addiction was viewed as some kind of moral issue or an individual that lacked willpower. It was very shameful to be struggling with addiction. There was no medical support whatsoever. There was even no psychotherapeutic support for the most part. So what you just had is a lot of individuals that were shunned by their families, shunned by the overall community, and they didn't know where to go. They didn't know what to do. So most people are probably aware, if you're interested in substance use disorder treatment, of Bill W. and his starting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and eventually what became the 12-step model of addiction treatment. This was a free model. These were individuals in the community that came together to support themselves. Also very strongly evolved out of what was called the Oxford Group, which was a faith-based organization. And so it's a very strong faith-based and particularly Christian component to Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12-step model. When you look at things like the Big Book, it has the words God in it all the time. And there's been evolutions of the way that that's interpreted. But early on, it was very much a faith-based, Christian-based approach to helping people in the community work together to solve their issues with originally alcohol and then eventually other drugs. So you had the free model. And then we moved on to the Minnesota model. And so the Minnesota model was the 1950s. It was actually developed by two psychiatrists at a mental health hospital in Minnesota, but it was very quickly picked up by a name that everyone's probably familiar with, the Hazelden Foundation, which is today Hazelden Betty Ford. Hazelden took what was or is now called the Minnesota model, and all this was really, in its simplest form, was taking 12-step AA models and putting it into a more medicalized, more formal setting. This is traditionally a 28-day treatment program. In the past, this could have been 90 days or longer, but when we think of the Minnesota model today, it starts off as a 28-day base. And so patients would go into this program and they would stay and live on site for 28 days or more, often more. And it was a very, very expensive model. So it served the top 1% of the US. There were scholarships and different options available, but for the most part, there was no insurance reimbursement, right? We didn't have insurance reimbursement for mental health issues, particularly addiction, until really the Parity Act and then Obamacare that kiboshed the whole disqualification for pre-existing conditions. So this long length of stay was very expensive. It was usually a cost of anywhere from $30,000 to $70,000 a month to go into treatment, all out of pocket. And these models that existed, eventually you had Hazleton Betty Ford, you had Care and Treatment Centers, Serenity Lane, Ashley Addiction Treatment, High Watch Recovery, all these programs that still exist today that originated and started with a very, very high cost, out of pocket private pay model. So they were serving the top 1%, these people that could afford this very high cost of treatment without insurance being able to provide any support. And then through these models, there was nowhere else to go. If you had the means to afford to go to these programs, you went, but you were also insanely grateful. The families were insanely grateful. And so even to this day, these models are still heavily supported through donations. And most of those donations come from the high net worth families and individuals who have been through the program themselves or had family members go through the program. And so we still see this. When you look at the 990s of most of these programs, you'll find that they're actually not financially sustainable on their own, even though they had this really high dollar revenue model that existed that doesn't exist anymore today, as we'll talk about as we move on into the progress of the space. And so now they're very much supported by donations. Now in the past, they were doing really well. They're very financially sustainable, a lot of revenue coming in. And so the models work. But today with the insurance environment the way it is, the significantly reduced reimbursement that comes from insurance versus these private pay models, they have struggled to adapt that very high cost delivery model to the significantly lowered reimbursement environment that exists today. Their operating costs are much, much higher. And so most of the legacy nonprofits, as I refer to them, have supplemented that through donations rather than changed the cost structure of the delivery model. So again, really important here, this was all 12-step, and we see 12-step, the AA model, used within addiction treatment really until 2018. So for 60, close to 70 years within the business model of SUD treatment, addiction was defined as a brain disease. Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill W. originally defined it as an allergy. So it was thought to be an allergy to alcohol or an allergy to other drugs. This mentality then evolved into genetics and brain diseases. And we saw that within the medical community for a long time. But it was very much this medical model of there's something wrong with this individual genetically or within their brain where they are not able to use alcohol or other drugs in ways that other individuals may be able to do. So that defined the clinical model, which meant that you could not go near drugs or alcohol, right? You have something wrong in your brain, you have some kind of genetic precondition. And so because of that, if you come in touch with alcohol or other drugs, you are going to go into this massive downward spiral that is very, very hard to get out of. And so that model is, okay, 100% abstinence, we stay away from all drugs, we stay away from all alcohol, and it is the only way that we can be successful. And so that's why we have these communities of other individuals like us. We live in sober communities, we build sober networks of friends in recovery, we go to AA meetings all the time because we need this constant support and reinforcement to be able to stay away from the drugs and alcohol that our biology is, encouraging us to go towards. So that was the model. Again, exorbitant out-of-pocket costs. I mean, really, really expensive. Now, of course, it takes a lot to run these facilities, but they were also catering to the top 1%, the people that could afford these programs. So when you look at these programs, when you look at your Karens, your Serenity Lanes, your Ashley Addiction Treatment Centers, they all have like 120 acres of land. They have very nice facilities. They have a lot of amenities on site, a lot of kind of white glove service from a clinical standpoint. That's how the models were built because that's who they were serving originally. And that's what people were looking for. Obviously, they were looking for recovery, but they were also looking for an environment that reflected the high cost that they were paying. These were and still are mostly nonprofit led. So you have the 990s, they're publicly available online. You can find out how much revenue they're making, how many donations there are. You do see something interesting with the nonprofit providers that there are very, very high executive salaries. So a lot of these nonprofit providers, the executives are making anywhere from $400,000 to $1 million a year. That is not so common within the nonprofit space, but it does reflect the large amounts of revenue that are coming into these models and how they are thinking about the caliber of the staff that they want or they need at their programs. And so they're willing to pay a very, very high amount to make sure that they have high quality programming and high quality staff at the executive level all the way down. So you see a really, really high labor cost. And that's one of the reasons that these programs struggle. It's their high labor cost. And then it's also just the high real estate costs. I mean, they have 100-year-old buildings. They have 120 acres of land. There's 10 to 15 buildings on the property that has to be maintained. So a lot of costs. And that's why these models are very difficult to make work. And this will become relevant as we start to move into the for-profit space as well. Just a side note, there also were methadone clinics that had started to spring up from the 1960s to 1970s until today. Very different from what we consider the traditional rehab model and what most people are investing in or building as a treatment program. We have seen expansion of MET providers, which could be a methadone clinic, could be a Suboxone provider today. But back then, prior to 2008, these worlds did not collide whatsoever. Methadone clinics were anathema to the 12-step model because it was considered replacing one drug for another. Remember, 12-step is a brain disease. You can't go near any kind of substance that might have a psychoactive property. And so methadone, being a psychoactive substance, a derivative of an opioid or an opioid itself, really, 12-step models were not supportive of it. So methadone clinics were kind of in their own world. They didn't associate with this world whatsoever related to the Minnesota model or any of the traditional rehabs from detox or residential to outpatient. And the methadone clinics also really focused on usually lower income environments. All they're providing in most methadone clinics, especially at that time, was a dosage of methadone. So individuals would show up in the morning, they'd get their dose of methadone and they'd leave. And so very, very small amount of revenue, very small margins on these programs. They really need high volume to survive. And so they're much more of a, what we would consider a lower income or a Medicaid model today versus the complete opposite end of the spectrum where we had the residential treatment providers serving the top 1%. Then we move post-2008, post-parity into what is really considered the wild, wild west of out-of-network or OON treatment. So parity actually came into play with the Mental Health Parity Act in 1996, but the act didn't have a lot of teeth. There wasn't a lot of enforcement to it, so the payers weren't taking a whole lot of action. And then we had additional legislation added, the Mental Health and Addiction Equity Parity Act that came around in 2008. That started to add more teeth to insurers making sure that they were reimbursing appropriately for these programs. And reimbursing appropriately meant matching with a physical program. So insurers started to compare things like how much are we paying a hospital per day to keep someone post cardiac surgery. And that's usually thousands of dollars a day, right? Insurance or hospitals get a lot of money for people that stay all day at the program. They have a lot of monitoring, you have high medical costs, et cetera. And so that was the initial model that the insurance payers used for residential care because these were individuals that were staying on site. They had round-the-clock medical support or counseling support. And so for that reason, that ended up being the initial payment structure. Then also really important to this was that Affordable Care Act, or the ACA, sometimes referred to as Obamacare, came into play in 2010. What was really important there was two factors for the addiction treatment space. Number one is it eliminated pre-existing conditions as a disqualification for insurance. Really important. So before, a lot of, especially high net worth families, wanted to do the private pay model because they did not want the addiction issue on their official medical record because they would be denied insurance moving forward for physical care, or their family member would be denied insurance. And so they were happy, let's say, to pay $50,000 to $75,000 just to enter these programs. And that was actually the model. If you looked at the Meadows, if you looked at Karen, if you looked at these other programs that cater to high net worth individuals from the private pay side, they would require a deposit of $50,000 before the family was even allowed to send the patient, or before the individual was even allowed to step foot on the property. So there was actually a lot of demand, very limited supply, and so the treatment providers could kind of set their own terms. Now that completely changed with the ACA, because now these individuals could not be denied insurance. It was no longer a concern. High net worth individuals tend to be pretty savvy with their money. And so they started to say, well, this isn't a concern anymore. I want to use my insurance because they're going to pay for this. Why would I want to pay out of pocket? And that started to change the model. The second factor that was really important to all of this was that now children were covered up to the age of 26 under their parents' policy. So I'm sure a lot of you remember, if you're my age or older, that a lot of us didn't have insurance, before the age of 26, or we had really, really crappy insurance that we got through the grocery store or the movie theater, or whatever it was that we were working at. Now, who uses a lot of drugs and alcohol? Is it older individuals, or is it your college kids and your high school kids? Obviously, you have a lot of kids in college that are experimenting with drugs and alcohol. There can be a lot of use issues, a lot of addiction issues that start to emerge at that time, but they didn't have insurance to take advantage of treatment methods that are available to them. So you didn't see that age demographic going into treatment at all. Now they suddenly had really good insurance because they were under their parents. So you had both these factors where you couldn't be denied as a pre-existing condition. You had the marketplace open up, so suddenly lots of more people had access to insurance than before. And you had people under 26, the 18 to 26 year olds, that now had access to really good insurance that hadn't before. This created an explosion of patients that were available to enter treatment facilities that had not been there before. And not only were they able to enter treatment facilities, but they were entering treatment facilities that were getting reimbursed huge amounts of money because of the out-of-network nature of the reimbursement environment at that time. What did this create? It created a feeding ground, unfortunately, for really rogue, shady providers. And this is very much a dark spot on the history of the industry. Prior to, you had these high-end, nonprofit, kind of private pay focused programs, but they were very, very much committed to the AA model, very much committed to quality care, helping people get into recovery. As we move into this 2008 to 2017 timeframe, you have a lot of people that are just getting in it for the money, that don't have a real interest in helping people find recovery. Now, of course, you still had great providers. There were still people that were building good programs, people that really cared, people with medical backgrounds or people with addiction backgrounds that wanted to do a good job and help others. But you also had this really significant portion of the field that was unfortunately just really profit driven and created a stain on the entire field that still exists today. You will still find articles, you'll find journalistic write-ups, you'll find even people like John Oliver doing exposés on the industry and some of the negative stuff that happens within the field of addiction treatment. That really started here because of the massive cash opportunities that were available. You have things like patient brokering. Patient brokering is when you pay someone for a patient. And this was happening all over the place. It still happens today, unfortunately. Again, it's with smaller providers today. It's with fly-by-nights. They usually don't last more than 1 to 3 years before they close up shop and disappear because they're not legitimate businesses, really. So it does still exist today, but back then it was rampant. It was ubiquitous. Lots of these really rogue, shady treatment providers were just paying people for patients. And they'd say, hey, you know what? I want you to go to the beach today, talk to anyone there that is using drugs and see if they want to come into treatment, and so that we can bill insurance and get reimbursed for them. That was happening all the time. Also, from a business model standpoint, that's the ideal model for any business. We're not paying a marketing cost or a sales cost unless you get us a result, right? It's basically a 100% pure commission structure. And so you're eliminating marketing and sales as a cost from your P&L. It was a very big win for these providers. On top of that, most of them were unsophisticated. They had never run a business before. They didn't know how business worked. They didn't understand investment. A lot of them were coming from addiction themselves, which I'll talk about in a second. So that meant a lot of immediate gratification. they're used to just taking the drug and getting an immediate high. In the business world, is translated into, I want to pay $1 and get $10,000 back immediately. And that was kind of what was happening. So you had patient brokering, unfortunate, really negative, because what it meant was patients weren't getting funneled into really quality care settings. They were just getting funneled into whatever provider was paying for them. Then you had lots of kickbacks. We'll talk a little bit about that through this slide. There was kickbacks to labs. There was kickbacks to sober living facilities. There was kickbacks to medical providers. Kickbacks to internally, patient brokering. They were paying commission structures to their admission reps on the phone, paying commission structures, or just basically paying for patients to anyone that was doing outreach. You had things as ridiculous as someone would be hired to go and find patients, and that individual would then literally use drugs or alcohol, admit themselves into a competing treatment provider, then talk to all the patients there and say, hey, you know what? I've got this better provider over here. On top of that, I'll give each of you $100 if you come with me tomorrow. We're all leaving tonight. And then literally that person would lead all the patients en masse to this other provider, get their commission for patient brokering, give a portion of that, their $100 each to the patients, and then leave and then do it all over again. I mean, there was just a ridiculous amount of really, really unfortunate activity happening at that time. Now, also, you were paying for flights, there were waived deductibles, so there was zero out-of-pocket cost to the patients or the families, which meant that there was no risk. So you had these families that were desperate to get their loved ones into care, and they had to pay nothing for it, literally nothing. And so it wasn't a hard decision for them to say, okay, well, I really care about my loved one or myself, if I'm calling for myself, and it's going to cost me $0. I'm going to go and I'm going to stay at this nice facility, blah, blah, blah. So setting the context for this, what was happening from the reimbursement side was that there was just massive, massive reimbursements because insurance didn't know how to handle it. There were no CPT codes. The billing infrastructure had not been created for addiction treatment. Parity and enforcement was just kind of thrust upon the insurance providers, and they didn't really pay attention to behavioral health, much less addiction treatment prior to that, because it wasn't something that they ever had to deal with often. It wasn't covered by insurance. It wasn't until the ACA that mental health had to be covered by insurance, just like physical care did. Even today, 99% of a payer's cost goes to physical care. It's diabetes, it's cancer treatment, it's cardiac surgery, it's orthopedic surgery, right? These really high cost lifestyle issues. Obesity is a major one, right? Very high cost to insurance payers, whereas behavioral health is a small little portion. So they weren't paying attention to it. So what happened is these road providers started billing the insurance company, and they would bill $1,000 a day. And then the insurance company would just write them a check for $30,000. Well, even back then, patients were saying again 90 days. So you had a patient that would say 90 days, they're getting $90,000 a patient. And then they would try to bill $2,000 a day. And suddenly insurance would pay it because no one was watching this stuff. No one was monitoring it at the payers. You had some providers getting paid $3,000 or $4,000 a day. So one patient in the program is literally bringing in, on average, about $200,000 in revenue. I mean, just insane amounts of money. On top of that, the cost structure for operating costs was very, very low. There was no regulation in the space. As I mentioned, it was a 12-step model, which meant really could just be run by people in recovery. Some states started to have some kind of counseling certificate requirement, but that was easy to get, in a short amount of time, usually less than a year. And a good portion of the group sessions could just be these 12-step big book meetings. And so you're literally paying people $10 to $15 an hour to run these groups. You're renting an office space. You don't need a medical environment. It's not like a hospital or a psych hospital where you need this $20 million facility with all these locked doors and anti-ligature and all that kind of stuff. For SUD, it was literally just a room where you had people go and do a group, and then maybe you had some office rooms. So you could go rent an office space, and then in the Florida model, which we'll talk about, you could go rent an apartment building. But basically, it's costing a couple $1,000s to get this thing off the ground. And literally within 2 to 4 weeks, you're making $90,000 to $200,000 a patient. On top of that, relapse or return to use is really common within the addiction treatment space, especially for these providers, because they weren't actually providing quality treatment. So you'd have someone go in for 3 months, they'd get all this massive reimbursement from the insurance company. The person would go out into Florida, where they often were, go onto the beach, get high again, and then they'd run out of money or get bored. And so they'd go back to the addiction treatment provider who was providing them room, housing, sometimes cigarettes, food, and they would do another 3-month stay. And so in 1 year, a single patient could be bringing in $500,000 in revenue, as they're going back to those providers. So just understand that the revenue was astronomical at this time, and the operating costs were incredibly low. So you had these individuals that had no business experience, that didn't know what they were doing, literally raking in millions of dollars a year in profit, unfortunately. A part of this was it became amenity focused. And the reason for that is you had a lot of individuals that weren't super serious about recovery. So South Florida in particular is well known as, unfortunately, a hotbed for shady business models, whether it's addiction treatment or pain clinics or senior care scams. This is just kind of an environment that exists in Florida to some degree. And these are the individuals that discovered addiction treatment as a very, very lucrative business model. So related to all of this, now again, going back, we didn't have a lot of addiction treatment providers across the country because insurance didn't cover it. And so it really served the top 1%. As insurance started to cover it, there weren't a lot of providers available, but this hotbed in Florida in particular, but you had Florida, you had Prescott, Arizona, you had Orange County, California. Those were kind of your 3 hotspots of the rogue and the shady providers, created what was a destination treatment model. And so the destination treatment model, because there was nowhere else to go. And so if I went online, in 2010, even really up to 2015 and looked for addiction treatment, I wasn't going to find anything around me. Nobody offered those services. All I would be able to find would be programs in Florida or programs in Arizona or California. And so an ecosystem started to develop in these areas for the fly-in model. So people would find these programs, they would fly down there, and then they would take advantage of them. But also what started to happen is the patients started to realize that there was these massive insurance reimbursements happening. If you know anything about addiction, you know that a lot of individuals that are going to treatment don't necessarily want to be there. They're at least ambivalent about treatment. A lot of individuals are pushed in by family, by their employers, by the legal system. And so when they go into treatment, they're not necessarily focused on actual recovery or care. So they were very happy to be complicit in a scenario where there wasn't a lot of quality care provided. And what were they looking for? They were looking for amenities. They wanted to be on the beach. They wanted a free Xbox. They wanted cigarettes. They wanted really good food. And because these treatment providers at the time were making so much money, they could provide all these things. And when you're making $200,000 a patient, and if you're seeing 20 patients every 90 days, that's 20 patients every 90 days, you're making a huge amount of money where you can afford a nice location on the beach. You can afford private rooms with Xboxes. You can afford a private chef that's preparing food for all the residents. And the residents then started to basically shop around. They saw their insurance card as a credit card. They'd walk into a treatment provider, especially as they were in the area for a while, and they would say, look, you know what? The treatment provider across the street, because there's literally 50 of them within walking distance, has free Xboxes for everyone. I'm going to go over there. And so there started to be competition in a capitalistic sense of not building better recovery treatment programming, but building more amenities into the programming, because that was the competition for these patients that were savvy enough that maybe weren't committed to recovery. This created what was called the Florida Shuffle. The Florida Shuffle was individuals that got flown down by their families into this environment of shady, rogue treatment providers, and they just popped from facility to facility. Again, that example of they get done, they go out, they go on a bender, they run out of money, they go back to the treatment provider, or they find a patient broker and they say, hey, look, last time this patient broker over at this place over here offered me $500. Can you give me $600 and I'll come to your treatment program for 3 months? And they go, they live there, they get food, play their Xbox, smoke their cigarettes, get a little bit of cash, and then do it all over again. That was the Florida Shuffle. So really unfortunate environment all around. Again, really big black stain on the field. So this Florida model, another element of it that's important from the business standpoint, is Florida was a bit unique, still is unique in the sense that the insurance payers down there weren't willing to reimburse for actual residential care. So a lot of reimbursements defined by the state. The state has licensing guidelines. Usually Health and Human Services sets these guidelines, or some government program under that department. And they said, we're not going to pay for residential care. So what Florida providers did is, this was great for them because it was cheap. They didn't even have to get 24/7 staffing. All they had to do was rent an office space that had group rooms, and then they could also go rent an apartment building for cheap. And their insurance reimbursements were more than enough to cover both of the lease costs. And then they would just have patients shuttled back and forth. So they would go, they'd pick up the patients at this apartment that they were renting, they'd shuffle them to the treatment program. There were literally treatment programs that would actually just rent out hotel rooms. And so from a pure cost standpoint, depending on the number of patients that they had at any given time, that's the number of rooms that they would rent out. And so they'd pay for these patients to stay at the hotels, sorry, not hospital, hotel. So they'd stay at the hotel, and then they would just pick them up with a van in the morning, have them go to group, and then bus them back at night and go back to the hotel. That was the Florida model, and you still see that model in some areas of the country. The issue with that model is it's not really above board as far as the payers are concerned most of the time. The payers aren't paying for residential, so their reimbursements should not be used to cover living expenses if it's not a residential model of care. Because the providers were making so much money, they could do it, but that's not what the insurance money was supposed to be used for. And so there were obviously conflicts there, sometimes clawbacks. And so you have to be careful with those kind of models. So I should comment, who were a lot of these rogue treatment providers? Again, like I said, you have a hotbed of really kind of shady businesses that exist in Florida in general. But you also had a lot of people that were coming in for treatment. So you had individuals, maybe they had a criminal record, they had been in and out of jail for drugs or drug-related crimes. Maybe they weren't really serious about joining, your standard 9-to-5 house, mortgage, 2.5 children kind of life. These were individuals that were a little bit more willing to live on the edge, oftentimes, especially if they were younger. So they would go into a program, and they're smart. Everyone's talking to each other. Plus, on top of that, the guy running it is just like them. They look at the guy that's running the program. He's coming in a Maserati. He's got a Rolex on his wrist. He's got multiple gold chains. And they find out that the guy's a 2-time felon and literally just got into recovery himself, 8 months ago. And so they go, what is going on here? And they learn about the business model. They learn all you got to do is get, a couple $1,000s, rent a facility. You can just have some low-level counselor or literally someone in the program run the AA meeting and start getting reimbursement from insurance for tens of thousands of dollars a month. And so it created a proliferation of all of these individuals that didn't have the best intentions of the patients at heart. They were just looking at it from a dollar and cents standpoint. And on top of that, you have the fact that a good portion of these people had criminal records. It was very difficult for them to get jobs in other verticals, other traditional business environments. And so not only was it hard for them to get a job, the job they were going to get was going to pay them $30,000 a year, $50,000 a year. Here, you could open up a treatment program and literally make millions of dollars a year because it was so unregulated and the reimbursements were so high. Now, within that framework, you had more savvy people come in, people that had more of a business background, that were more sophisticated. Maybe this was an individual that was shipped down from New York or New Jersey that came from an upper income home or an entrepreneurial home or a small business background. And they're seeing the same thing that the other individuals that maybe don't have a business background saw, but they can see it from a more professional context. So these individuals started to see the opportunity. They started to build programs as well. And most of them started in Florida, but they were smart enough to say, hey, this is a destination treatment model. We see the amenities focus here. We see the revenues focus here. So what we're going to do is we're going to start buying programs across the country. This is where you saw the expansions of like your Sovereign Health, your Solid Landings, your Elements Behavioral, which is now Promises Behavioral, your American Addiction Centers. Recovery Centers of America has even built off that model, though it was built a bit later than some of these other ones. And the whole idea here was we're going to go and buy 120 acres of land often in the middle of nowhere, 2 hours from the nearest urban center. We're going to have tons of amenities, and we're going to have a more professional focus, higher quality clinical, higher focus on quality care in addition to the amenities, professionalize our call centers, professionalize our marketing. Because for all these other little guys who were such a supply, demand, imbalance, that again, if you search for treatment, you couldn't find anything, you were inevitably going to find one of these programs. And most of them were small. There were 10 beds, 20 beds. And so you'd call and they were full. They didn't have any room because they're keeping people for 90 days, sometimes more. And so they'd have to call the next program and the next program. So all of this demand allowed supply to kind of open up and open up. So the professional guys that came in, the more sophisticated business operators, then said, well, why don't we build a 100 or 200 bed program, and we'll build it, near Nashville, Tennessee. We'll build it in Central Ohio. We'll build it in Southern Texas. And that's what they started to do. And then they also started to outcompete the shady and the rogue providers because they understood marketing, they understood sales, they understood systems and operations, they understood professionalization. And so they started to create these more sophisticated treatment programs. And that's where private equity really started to turn their eye towards the space. They started to see the massive reimbursements that were coming in, the opportunity that was happening. And so we started to see an introduction into sponsor-backed portfolio companies. You even had American Addiction Centers that went public. They did an IPO in 2014. They're the only program that's done an IPO in the addiction treatment space. So that didn't become a standard model. But you see that there was an evolution of professionalization in some ways. And this becomes important later because it creates a legacy for-profit model that we'll talk about. Last factor here within this post-parity world and the out-of-network wild, wild west is the opioid crisis or the opioid epidemic. What was going on here, 2010 to 2013? Right? Again, just in coinciding with Obamacare, you had suddenly your 18 to 26-year-olds being covered under really good parents' insurance that wasn't done before. And you had a lot of kids that started using prescription opioids or even heroin. That's a big deal. Now think about it. Maybe you're a parent yourself. Maybe you experimented with alcohol or maybe even marijuana in high school or college, and maybe you got caught. What do you do these days if you're in the same situation with your own kids? Depending on your values, depending on your perspective, maybe that's upsetting to you, maybe it's not. You sit down, maybe you have a conversation with your kids. But for the most part, you're not really worried. You might be upset. It might be concerning for you. It might be something you want to talk to your kids about. But what you're probably not going to do is ship your kid off to a residential treatment program for 90 days because you caught them drinking beer at a high school party, or you caught them smoking pot in the car with their friends. These are things that you're probably going to deal with as a family with your son or your daughter. And that's going to be that for the most part. Now, when you got into opioids and heroin in particular, that was scary. That was scary for a lot of moms. Heroin is considered a really scary street drug in the first place. And then on top of that, we had all the media coverage. We had all the hysteria, legitimate hysteria around overdoses and just people being overdosing left and right on these opioids. So that created a situation where you caught your kid doing heroin, or you caught your kid overdosed in their bedroom after taking too many Vicodin or something, and you shipped them off to treatment immediately because you were scared that they were going to die. This wasn't alcohol. This wasn't marijuana. This was an immediate crisis that needed to be solved. Now, you think about yourselves, when you're in high school or college, or you think about your kids or your average teenager, how serious are they about quitting alcohol use or drug use? Usually not very. Mom's forcing them to go. Mom's forcing them in treatment, and maybe they're giving them an ultimatum and saying, hey, I'm going to kick you out of the house unless you go. So the kid says, fine, I'm going to go, but I want to go somewhere nice. And so you search online and you find this really nice place on the beach, and it sounds like they even give you a private room with an Xbox. They're like, okay, Mom, I'll go there. Kid goes down into the program, starts that whole cycle where they see that, wow, this is a major moneymaker. My parents' insurance card, I can use like a credit card to get what I want, to go where I want. This is a great environment. I'm with all these other people that are in a similar boat to me, a bunch of young people that are really interested in partying. We're just kind of getting free room and board when we need it. Maybe we're getting some kickbacks. I can go to the beach. There's a whole party scene there. And so that really exploded the Florida shuffle with all these young kids that weren't serious about treatment. And so this created an environment where you had a lot of negativity because it was self-reinforcing, right? The patients ended up being complicit in the negative treatment models, which only reinforced the rogue treatment providers to open up more and more programs. And then on the flip side of that, you had all the parents that were worried sick, and they're like, what happened to my kid? Where are they? Are they getting better? They start to get wind of this stuff. There starts to be stories about it. Journalists start to get involved. Eventually the Attorney General and the State Department got involved in Florida and started to have a really big focus on it. So there was government meetings, there was local community meetings, there was news stories. And so this created part of that taint that I'm talking about the field. So you had all these really concerned moms sending their kids down that just want to make sure that their kid doesn't die. And instead they're going into an environment where it's actually reinforcing the very behaviors that they're looking to mitigate. And on top of that, they're getting these massive insurance bills. And so eventually insurance stops covering it, as we'll start talking about in the next slide. Another part of all of this was labs. So there was kickbacks everywhere, and labs were part of it. Not only were you able to get $30,000 to $90,000 a month per patient just for providing treatment services, on top of that, the providers found out that you could get urine screens approved. And a urine screen was as much as $2,500 per urine screen, and you could urine screen a patient up to 3 times per week. So now on top of everything, you're getting $7,500 per week to urine screen your patients. But these guys that just rented some office space and maybe an apartment building don't have the labs to do that. So then there became an entire model of labs that sprung up doing these really, really insanely overpriced, because it only cost them like $10 to $20 to do the actual screen. So $10 to $20 of operating overcost for a $2,500 reimbursement. They started to do a lot of kickback schemes and profit sharing between the treatment providers, the recovery residences, and these labs that were processing the urine screens. And that became a whole another issue within the space. There was even a point, if you look at American Addiction Centers, they had bought a lab at one point, and they were public at this time, so all this was public information. The lab revenue was actually greater than their treatment revenue. There was another provider that I won't share the information, but it was a very large one at the time. They eventually went out of business, but they were making most of their money from urine screens. And so when United in particular kiboshed the urine screen game and said, hey, we're not going to give you $2,500 per urine screen anymore, there was actually internal documentation that they were going to take United to court and saying, this is ridiculous. Like, we need to get reimbursed for this. This is care for our patient. Obviously, it was all BS, but you can see the unprofessionalism still existing in the space, even for the larger operators at that time, where they thought that this gravy train of just really high reimbursements and ridiculous reimbursements on the urine screens was going to continue forever. And it just didn't. And that's why you saw so many bankruptcies over time as the model shifted, which we'll talk about in a second. So within all of this, you have the supply-demand imbalance, right? You could open up shop and the phone just started ringing. You didn't have to do a whole lot. On top of that, you didn't have to pay marketing sales expenses. If you didn't have a full program, you would just go find someone and say, hey, look, you go out there, and if you find me patients, I'll pay you for it. And maybe they might do one of these raids into another treatment provider. Some of them would literally coast down the beach and just call out to people and say, hey, anyone looking for housing? Anyone want play Xbox for a month? Anyone want a $100 kickback? They'd pick them up, shuffle them to the treatment program. You'd have people going into AA meetings and then doing the same kind of shady dealing. And so the supply-demand imbalance created a very, very easy environment to find patients and bring them into the program. Now, slowly but surely, that started to die. There were so many programs. You started to get the sophisticated operators in there, like I talked about, the more professional operators that weren't doing the scams or hopefully weren't doing the scams. And so they were starting to get a lot of the volume because they were marketing. And they were running their Google ads. They were doing search engine optimization. They were building relationships with healthcare providers. And so suddenly the volume started to funnel to these more professional operators. And so all your shady rogue operators or you're just less professional providers that really cared about the patients and were trying to build a good program, but didn't know how to build a business, as is often with healthcare owner operators. They didn't know how to market. So people started to figure out that Google ads was one way that you could market in the space. And what happened was there started to be millions and millions and millions of dollars invested into Google ads, within a very short window of time. Some providers were paying as much as $1 million a month in Google ads. And that was actually really common, especially for a larger operator. This created a scenario where addiction treatment terms and drug rehab terms became the highest cost item to bid on within a Google auction in the world. So you were paying north of $60 a click, sometimes up to $300 a click when it was really insane back in those days. And so Google ads were a way to get in front of patients and try to get people into your program and compete. Now, because it was so insane due to the vast amount of money being poured into the space, the cost per admission was often like $15,000. You had to pay a lot of money to Google ads because the cost per click was so high. These weren't professional operators. They didn't know how to answer the phone. They didn't know how to arrange logistics with people. This is something the industry learned over time. And as it learned this, then they started to professionalize a little bit more. But back then, $15,000 as a cost per admission. That's crazy, right? Can you imagine any other healthcare provider paying $15,000 to get someone into their program? But again, these guys were making $200,000 per patient. So for them to pay $15,000 to get $200,000 in revenue was a very easy trade-off. You didn't have to be a good business operator to understand that number worked. On top of that, we have what I call BD horse trading. So business development or community outreach. Operators were starting to stratify a little bit, so you had different levels of care. You had someone that was a residential, someone that was a partial hospitalization program, someone that was an intensive outpatient program. Some people started having different insurance contracts. Someone might take Cigna and United, someone else might take Anthem and Blue Cross Blue Shield. And so they basically pooled their resources in a sense, and they would just share referrals between each other. One program would get a call in, it would be Blue Cross Blue Shield, which they didn't take. So they would call their buddy treatment center and say, hey, I got Blue Cross Blue Shield. Do you have bed space? Can you take them? And they'd say, yeah, sure. And then vice versa, they would get a call for a United policy. And they're like, oh, well, we don't take that one, but our partner facility over here takes United. We can refer you to them. And so basically these programs would just create a collective pool of marketing dollars. And on a smaller marketing budget, they could then kind of finance each other's businesses in a way by trading referrals back and forth. And that started happening with the boots on the ground perspective as well. So you'd have individuals that would go out and they'd build relationships with other treatment centers and they'd say, okay, you guys take United. We don't take United, but we take Blue Cross Blue Shield. You don't take Blue Cross Blue Shield. Let's trade. Or you guys are residential. We're a detox. And so if you need someone that calls in and they're drunk on the phone, well, legally you can't take them. Insurance isn't going to pay for that. They need to go to detox first. So you refer the detox to them. We'll send them back to you for residential or vice versa. And the reason that happened was because the investment dollars required to start the different levels of care, the experience around the different levels of care. Detox is a much more serious investment. It requires a more professional environment with medical doctors and nursing staff to be able to manage the comfort meds and the detox protocols. Also, just the expense. Insurance did start to get wind of everything that was happening. They started to put controls in place. They started to put requirements around reimbursements. And so they started to have different scenarios where you could get reimbursed, which means that you need more professionalization, more cost, more licensing requirements, more accreditation requirements, more staffing requirements. So you have different capital costs to create these different levels of care, which meant that different people at different income levels or with different access to capital would create different levels of care. And basically the people with more income would create the detoxes or the residentials. The people with less capital would create the partial hospitalizations or the intensive outpatients. And then they would just work together in kind of like a shared business environment. So this created this scenario for reciprocity referrals, or what I often refer to as horse trading within the business development environment. Even today, when you look at a lot of business development reps, they still operate off of this old model because that's what they grew up with. They're not very good at talking to a hospital or a counselor or a psychologist. They're used to going to coffee or lunch or going to a golf game with another business development rep because they were trying to trade levels of care or trying to trade insurance policies. That's no longer viable, as we'll talk about on the next slide. Then all this time, what are the legacy nonprofit providers doing? They're getting really upset by all of this. these legacy nonprofit providers really cared about the patients. They cared about quality care. Again, there was often a strong faith-based element to it. A number of these nonprofit providers, these legacy nonprofits, were founded by clergy, by people with a religious background. So they're really focused on getting people quality care. And then they're seeing all of these individuals doing all this shady stuff and unfortunately getting people that are struggling with addiction into really poor quality negative situations. On top of that, they're seeing their patient volume dip off. So I'm calling into a program, and this program tells me, hey, we need $50,000 cash up front for us to be able to take you or your loved one into treatment. And then they call 2 Florida providers or 2 providers in Prescott, Arizona, and they're like, oh no, we'll pay for your flight. We're going to waive your deductible and you can get in here tomorrow and we've got a really nice program. So for a lot of people, they're like, oh, and plus we're going to take your insurance, right? So they're going to be like, yeah, I'm just going to go with this provider here that looks just as nice as you, care and treatment centers, but is going to cover all my costs and I'm not going to owe a dime out of pocket. So they start to see this funneling away of their traditional business model, in addition to the changing macro environment of insurance becoming a priority, which was something that was new to them. So this is where the legacy nonprofit providers are, and you start to see a really strong bifurcation in the space of your old school nonprofit legacy providers, which were usually associated with a national organization called NATAP, the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers, versus this new generation and breed of treatment providers, many of which were rogue or shady. But then also you had the professional operators coming out of that. You still had the quality providers, the people that care, that were starting to come out of that. But these were all for-profit models. And so there was a divide in the space at that time that was creating 2 different trajectories and models. So this brings us to 2017 and the present, or at least many of the trends that are continuing to the present, which is the move to in-network. This was massive. It had massive repercussions across the space because it reduced reimbursement, it professionalized the space, it created higher requirements around licensing, around accreditation, around the way that you got insurance reimbursement or insurance contracts, and also patient volume. What was happening as this move to a network happened is basically the payers started to recognize the fact, they became cognizant of the fact that they were losing all this money. So they looked at their balance sheets and they looked at their cash flows and like, my God, where are these tens of millions of dollars going that we didn't see 5 years ago? And they dig into it and they find out that it's these addiction treatment providers that they don't even have CPT codes for. So their reimbursement departments are just kind of making up numbers and paying people, and they're paying them huge amounts of money. Payers get wind of it, they start to crack down. So they start to crack down on readmissions. They say, look, this patient's been into 4 treatment programs in the past year. We're not going to cover treatment anymore because clearly it's not working for them clinically. This is not the right method. We're cutting them off. So that started to cut reimbursement. Then they started to cut out-of-network reimbursements in general. So they had regulations around that. They couldn't just cut it by 50%, but they started to. And then they made strategic investments to say, we're going to build an in-network group of providers to funnel patients into. And so they started really pushing in-network contracts with providers, which originally no one wanted. But as that supply-demand imbalance started to shift, what was slowly happening, even in the past, but definitely in 2017, it started to accelerate significantly. We started to see a lot of providers pop up. And so now that supply-demand imbalance was no longer really there. Even on my end, so the marketing company that I own, our biggest complaint where we got a lot of clients from in this window of time, like 2017, 2018, you'd have legitimate providers call us and they'd say, look, the phone just used to ring off the hook. We never did marketing and we were always full. And now the phone doesn't ring. No one even knows we exist. What was happening is there was too many providers and too few patients seeking treatment. On top of that, you had that professionalization that was coming from these more sophisticated entries into the space, your treatment management solutions, your American Addiction Centers, your Elements Behavioral. And because they were doing good marketing, they were able to get in front of everybody. They had the SEO, they had the Google ads, they had the business development outreach. And so they were attracting all the patients into their programs, and these providers that had never done any of that, who had just basically relied on the fact that there was more demand than there was supply and people were somehow going to find them, now we're unable to compete. So we would get these calls and say, look, we don't know what to do. I'm like, well, have you done any marketing? Have you done any outreach? What's your website look like? What's your search engine optimization? They would be like, well, we don't even know what those things are, right? So this was happening in the space too. And this drove the move in network, because how do you get patients? So as this move in network was happening, also with the ACA and everything that drove insurance costs, the premiums were getting higher. The out-of-network deductibles were getting significantly higher. Deductibles in general were getting higher. There were co-pays, et cetera, et cetera. It now made sense for patients to go in-network, because in-network was cheaper for them. It was less deductible. It was maybe no co-pays. And so patients wanted to go in-network. And so now in an environment where there's not a supply-demand imbalance, where there's actually too much supply, now you have to compete for patients. So you've got to get good at marketing. You have to get good at outreach. But you also have to be attractive to patients, which means lower cost services. People wanted in-network. So this really was a catalyst for a lot of providers starting to go in-network. So as everyone moves in network, obviously the payers start to take control. They start to control their costs. And they say, hey, look, not only are we going to have quality controls in place, we want to see that you're licensed by the state. We want to see some kind of accreditation like JACO or CARF. And we're going to cut reimbursements down. This $200,000 a month that you guys were making per patient, that's ridiculous. That doesn't make sense. And so you saw them chopping the reimbursement rate slowly over the next couple of years. And so now we're at about 60% or less of what providers were making in the out-of-network Wild West times. So that pressure created a very new business environment where you had licensing costs, you had regulation costs, you had higher staffing costs because you needed higher quality. Your reimbursements were significantly lower, and so your operating costs couldn't be as high. This created a big problem. It created a big problem for these individuals who didn't know how to run a really lean, really efficient business. They were just used to literally bleeding money out the door and still being profitable. And so that created an environment of professionalization where a lot of providers just went out of business. And this is also where you saw a lot of the bankruptcies with your Elements Behavioral, your Solid Landings, your Sovereign Health, American Addiction Centers eventually went bankrupt. Why were these bankruptcies happening? Because of all these situations. Their operating cost structure was so high. Again, they were paying $15,000 per admission from the marketing side, sometimes more. They had bought massive real estate, 120 acres, gorgeous facilities, really expensive costs. And then now their reimbursements were 60% of what they had been previously. That created a major pressure on the industry to change. And some of the large providers still haven't recovered from that. Keep in mind that the patients were preferring the lower cost option. So if your operating costs are really high, that's going to make you kind of try and cherry pick policies. That's going to make you more stronger, more enforcement around collecting deductibles and copays. Of course, providers are supposed to collect those no matter what. But what you saw was some of the smaller providers would waive those things. And so that would draw patients away sometimes. And so this move for lower cost options, also more local options. At the end of the day, when you look at where providers want to go, where patients want to go, they want to go somewhere close to home. There was this myth in the field that people should get away from their existing environment, get out of it, go somewhere far away. That's not what patients want. If you look at your data nationally, about 70% of all patients go within a 70-mile radius, and about 95% of all patients go within a 150-mile radius of where they live for residential levels of care. And then, of course, most people don't need residential, right? Most people need lower levels of care like intensive outpatient treatment. So then they're going to go in a 10 to a 30-mile radius. So you see this preference for lower cost treatment. You see this preference for local treatment, and that's having a massive impact on the space as well. So this creates a forced restructure of operating costs that a lot of providers just aren't able to meet, and that's why we see the bankruptcy. On top of that, think of these models. So you've got American Addiction Centers. They have a massive campus, Oxford, in Etta, Mississippi. It's an hour and a half south of Memphis, like literally the middle of nowhere. You had addiction campuses, which became Vertava Health, which then got sold again. And that's in Shepherdsville, Ohio, which is 2.5 hours away from any urban area. It's 2.5 hours away from Cleveland, from Cincinnati, from Columbus. How are you going to get patients out there? Not only do you have to get patients to go there when there are literally 30 other providers in their backyard, so they could drive 10 minutes away or they could drive 2.5 hours away. Like, which one are you going to choose? you also have a staffing issue. You need labor out there. And prior to 2017, you were making all this money. So you could offer a really attractive salary for someone to come and live in the middle of nowhere. You could pay twice the going rate for a nurse or for a therapist. And they were willing to make that move with their family for the significant reimbursement. But as the reimbursements were reduced by insurance, as people were forced to move in network, the costs increased. And so now they needed to offer salaries that were comparable to what that person could get in Columbus or Cincinnati or Cleveland. And so now there's no reason, there's no motivation to go and live in Shepherdsville, Ohio, or in Scurvy, Texas. That created a major problem for these providers, as they couldn't find the talent to staff these programs. The only way to get talent was to pay more, but they weren't getting reimbursed more to be in the middle of nowhere. They also had all these real estate costs of paying for 120 acres. There's maintenance, there's upkeep, there's depreciation, there's just the mortgage costs in general. These are massive costs that these providers are dealing with. And so that really created a major problem for the for-profit legacy providers. It's also actually a problem for the legacy nonprofit providers, because they're in the same boat. They used to make all of this money, get all this reimbursement, especially from the private pay side of things. And now they're stuck with 120 acres and they're in the middle of nowhere, and they have these same challenges that the for-profit providers do. So with all of this, the horse trading continues on the referral side, especially on the business development side, because there's stratification in levels of care, there's stratification in insurance contracts that exist. But what happens is that because there's so much pressure on reimbursement and total revenue, we need to move in network because we need to be able to accept all the patients. In the past, we're getting all these calls and we're cherry picking. We're saying, well, we're just going to take the out-of-network policies and we'll refer out the in-network policies or the people that really want an in-network program. Well, that's no longer viable because there's so many in-network options that's what patients prefer to go to. There's a very small number of people that are willing to pay more to go to an out-of-network program, especially if the programs are comparable. So everyone realizes that they have to move in network to be economically viable. So that removes the situation where there's any kind of horse trading between insurance policies. And then the same thing happens with levels of care. So as we're getting really strong downward pressure on reimbursement rates, suddenly that $15,000 I was paying as a patient acquisition cost is no longer viable because I'm only making $15,000 total per patient in a residential setting. That doesn't make sense, right? That's not going to work economically. So I've got to reduce my marketing costs. And so that creates diversification within the marketing portfolio, which was a good thing. It's pretty ridiculous that anyone in healthcare is paying so much of their revenue and insurance reimbursement towards marketing costs. They should be going towards clinical care. So that was a very positive move for the space, is to reduce the reliance on high cost channels like Google ads or overly highly paid business development reps. So that standardized the field a bit, which was good. Additionally, they needed more revenue per patient. And the only way to get more revenue per patient was to extend the continuum of care. So now, instead of just offering residential and referring out for intensive outpatient, we're offering residential and we're offering intensive outpatient. Not only that, we added on a detox. So now we get the revenue from the patient through the full continuum of care, in addition to be able to admit every single call that we get. Again, we're paying all these marketing dollars. There's all this massive expense going to marketing, and we're only able to convert the small number of people that fit the criteria for residential. That's not economically viable. We need to be able to admit and convert all of the call volume that comes in. So we need to be all in network. We need to have a full continuum of care. And that's what you saw happen. And that's why the horse trading, the referral, the reciprocity between addiction treatment providers really died from the outreach side of things, because there's no one to refer to. Everyone's all in network. Everyone has full continuums. There is no arbitrage that's able to happen between different levels of care or different providers, and to make that work. Now, another factor that's happening here is people starting to pivot finally in 2018 towards multiple pathways to recovery. Prior to that, it was all 12-step, all AA. It was all brain disease. It's really, really focused on this fact that AA is the only way to find recovery. This was a pretty fervent belief in the field as well. everyone that had grown up in addiction treatment and recovery had gone through an AA model. It was the only model that they knew. And so for a lot of people, they believed it was the only model that worked. As you start to see more professionalization, especially more outside investment from private equity, they came in and said, what is this AA thing? I'm reading this big book. It just seems to be very, very faith-based. I don't see a lot of clinical evidence here. I'm not seeing a lot of academic literature on efficacy of the programming. And then in addition to that, there was a pretty sizable number of patients that weren't interested in it. There were a lot of patients that were turned off by the faith-based element. Also, they were turned off by this idea that I have a disease, that I'm powerless, that it's something in my genetic makeup that means I'm broken. That did not make sense to a significant portion of the patient population. And so providers were losing patients because they did not have a clinical model that matched up with patient needs and patient perspectives. That opened a doorway to multiple pathways to recovery and also to MAT. So this is when you started to see like your BHGs, your clean slates, your community medical services really start to expand across the country because these models became more accepted and there was a lot more research behind them. There was a lot more government push, a lot more government funding behind the MAT models. There's also a lot more academic push and a lot of professional push from investors to move into a multiple pathways to a recovery model. I remember sitting at a conference in 2018 and I was talking about MAT that had started to come up in the space, and all the executives at the table were like, oh my God, no, that ridiculousness, just trading one drug for another, that's never going to have any viability in our space. Like we wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. And then now it's the norm. Almost everyone has integrated MAT, primarily because of the insurance push. Insurance said, look, if you're not providing MAT to opioid patients with an opioid use disorder, we're not going to go and network with you. And so the payers really drove a lot of that shift in the space, but there's also just a cultural shift overall within the field of behavioral health where there's more academic support, there was more political support. People started to understand that AA and 12 steps were not the only method of viable recovery, and that it actually didn't work for a certain segment of the patient population. And so you needed to have other options. And so we started to see people add in and integrate different methods of care, different modalities, and especially MAT for opioid use disorder. So throughout all of this, we have the death of destination treatment. So it's really 2019 to present. All of these factors I just talked about, people stopped flying around the country. That still happens to a very, very small degree. And there are some very small niches like the top 1%. The top 1% are still willing to fly somewhere for very specialized care or specialized amenities within the program setting. But 99% of people are going to go somewhere in network. They're going to go somewhere close to home. And so we don't see this destination model working anymore. There has been and continues to be an explosion of providers. It's not just private equity, it's little investors, it's mom and pops, it's family offices that have been opening programs across the country. If you look up drug rehab, addiction treatment, or any kind of behavioral health services in any urban environment, you'll find that there are 30 to 40 programs within driving distance. There are a ton of programs everywhere these days. And so you just don't have a need to travel, and you don't want to, right? I'm already struggling with addiction, or my family member is, I've already probably incurred significant financial costs because of that. Now I'm going to pay for a plane ticket and send them halfway across the country, so I don't know where they're going to go. And on top of that, I've got this massive insurance deductible, that 5 years ago wasn't there. Like there's all these costs that come into play in terms of time, money, commitment that people aren't willing to make. So they're going local. And they're also having a massive competition locally because there's 30 to 40 providers in a local area. It makes it very, very difficult. Also with the travel, that got kiboshed. So you had the ECRA, which is the Eliminating Kickbacks and Recovery Act, and it has your anti-patient brokering laws. So it became strictly illegal to pay for patients, especially within SUD. It's actually specifically in the laws that SUD providers cannot provide any kind of kickback or any kind of commission structure even. So even for their outreach reps, they can't provide a commission structure or a performance-based incentive bonus that is based on the number of patients that are referred into the program. You also can't pay for flights anymore. So paying for flight travel was banned. It's actually made illegal. Obviously, waiving deductibles, waiving copays has always been illegal, but there was stronger enforcement around that as well. So a lot of these things that made it no cost to patients were eliminated and started to have a lot of teeth. And even today, 2024, 2025, we're starting to see really massive enforcement legally both by states and the federal government around these issues, because there's a lot of concern for people struggling with addiction as a vulnerable population that have been taken advantage of. The areas of the country that were hurt most by this were Florida, Arizona, California. These have always been the hotbed of the really shady providers, the ones doing the lowest quality work. We did see some Florida operators start to move into like New Jersey and Massachusetts, and so it became a problem in the upper East Coast a bit as well. But for the most part, the shady operators were really confined to these areas. And today, the vast majority of providers are on the up and up. They're very high quality. They really care about the work they're giving to patients, the care they're delivering, the quality of their services. So the field and the environment has changed significantly back from the early days, the 2008 to like 2016 period where the shady operators just exploded. You still have shady operators. It does still exist, unfortunately, but they're a very small minority of the treatment environment these days compared to the past. With the death of destination treatment, the legacy for-profit models and the legacy nonprofit models have continued to struggle more and more. Again, people are going local. They're not traveling for treatment in the first place. And then all those issues I talked about, they're in the middle of nowhere. Why am I going to travel to a program 2.5 hours away in the middle of nowhere? If I'm in American Addiction Centers and I have a really high-end program in Eda, Mississippi, what am I going to do? I'm going to fly into Memphis and then drive another hour and a half down to Eda. Like it's really hard to convince patients to do that unless there's something really, really special about the program. And so that's created a struggle for the legacy providers. They have a lot of beds to fill. So when supply-demand imbalance was significant, there was so much demand. It made sense to have a 100-bed, 200-bed facility because you were funneling people from all over the country. Now you're not. Now you're funneling people from a 70-mile radius. And so there's not as many people that need addiction services in addition to the massive competition. I've got 30 to 40 other providers I'm competing with in the area now that are obviously taking some of the patient volume. So how do I fill 100 and 200 beds? And then finally, you have that labor cost component. How the heck are we going to get people to go and move to the middle of nowhere, Mississippi, the middle of nowhere, Ohio? It's very, very difficult to staff those models in any kind of cost-effective sense on top of the exorbitant real estate costs to upkeep and maintain these large properties. Another element that happened here related to labor costs was the emergence of dual diagnosis. So this might sound surprising to people if they're not in the space, but when you think of someone that's struggling with addiction, why are they struggling with addiction? There's usually some kind of underlying root causality. And the same thing with depression, anxiety. So if I lose my father to cancer, I might get really depressed, which then leads to me using prescription pills or alcohol to manage my depression. Really, really common scenario, makes sense to us. That is not how the American behavioral health system works. American behavioral health, substance use is over here, and standard mental health, behavioral health is over here. And these two worlds don't talk to each other. They don't even get reimbursed the same. They don't even get licensed the same. Most states have different departments for these treatment modalities. And even in the insurance payers, there's different reimbursement mechanisms, different CPT codes, completely separate worlds within American healthcare. So again, it doesn't make sense to the outside average observer. You're like, obviously, the mental health issues contribute to the substance use, and the substance use contributes to the mental health issues. These things are clearly a feedback loop, a really strong interplay. Not how the American health system has worked. That changed in 2019, and you started to see a big upswing towards what was called dual diagnosis or co-occurring disorders. So you have a substance use disorder under the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, and then you also have depression. And so you have two co-occurring disorders is the way that it is kind of thought about and the way it's billed. And so this was called dual diagnosis. So now you have individuals that have to be able to help patients with dual diagnosis. Well, what did that mean? That actually meant higher labor costs. Because again, remember addiction treatment, it's over here, it's completely separate licensing, reimbursement, etc. You could have someone with a counseling certificate from a community college that's focused on addiction. That's it. It's not very hard to find these individuals. They're fairly low cost from a labor standpoint. Once you involve mental health, depression, anxiety, OCD, suicidality, etc., now the states require and the insurance payers require master's level clinicians. That means that these are people that went to graduate school, that have done 1,000 to 1,500 hours, depending on the state, of a licensing program. So they're commanding salaries of often $80,000 a year or more. You also potentially need psychiatrists involved in the program now because they have to have a medication component for the mental health disorders. So now you have a massive labor cost increase to do a dual diagnosis program, and everyone becomes dual diagnosis because, again, you have to. I'm calling in for treatment. I know that I've got depression, anxiety, and substance use disorder, and I need someone that can help me with all three of these things, not just one at a time. So as everyone becomes dual diagnosis, that again increased the labor costs. So we see all of these pressures, right? We have to see increasing costs, reducing reimbursement, lack of flying treatment, just massive shifts to the entire environment of SUD. As I mentioned already, this is why you also see the extension of the continuum of care. Everyone has to offer dual diagnosis. Everyone has to have a full continuum of care. Everyone has to be in network with all the payers because you need to convert all of your call volume. You can't pay all this marketing cost. You can't have all this overhead if you're not able to admit every single patient that contacts you. And then in addition to that, you need the revenue. You need the full cycle of revenue from detox down to outpatient to make the program work, just due to the massive competition, your marketing costs, your overhead costs, etc. Okay, that move to in-network really sets the stage for the current business environment that we're in. But I do want to take a small diversion into the COVID era and telehealth excitement around it. There's really 2020 to 2022. Obviously, everyone's stuck at home. You have your lockdowns. People can't go outside. We're hearing a lot about the explosion of mental health and substance use issues related to COVID, related to the lockdowns, etc. You see an explosion of telehealth providers. So partly this is just a look at potential opportunity, and then partly it was just a reaction to what are we going to do? We're locked down. We can't see patients. That didn't turn out to be the case. There was very quickly provisions made for individuals to go to healthcare providers and for healthcare providers to go to work. So the inpatient models were not really affected at all in this situation. But we did see an explosion of providers that started to offer these services. Basically, every single client we had thought they were going to offer a telehealth program. They're like, oh, we're going to serve patients across the country now, right? We can do everything online. It's going to lower our costs. That never turned out to be a reality. Most patients want in-person care, especially at higher levels of care. For your just general outpatient, you can do a telehealth model. But anything above that, intensive patient and above, people want in-person the majority of the time. You also saw a lot of private equity-backed telehealth providers. You saw Cerebral, Talkspace, Ginger, BetterHelp is still around. So these companies had a lot of investment, and they all really failed. None of them have made money. BetterHelp just released their financials at the end of 2024. They're still unprofitable. Even if you look at Teladoc, which has been around for a long time on the physical healthcare side of things, that company's unprofitable. It's very, very hard to make money on the telehealth side of things, which private equity quickly learned. So everyone was drinking the same Kool-Aid. Everyone thought there was going to be this massive opportunity. That did not turn out to be the case. It's still not really the case today. Telehealth is a great supplement to a program. If you've got individuals that are unwilling to come in person or don't want to, you can offer a telehealth option. It can be a good step-down option for a higher level of care. If I've got someone coming from 150 miles away into my residential program, I could potentially provide ongoing telehealth services at lower levels of care. That's a way for me to keep the patient connected to my system. But these are supplemental service lines and revenue streams. They are not primary for most providers. So it was quickly disillusionment with telehealth, both from the private equity side as well as your strategic organizations, your established organizations, even if they weren't private equity backed, pulled back significantly from telehealth just because it has not proved to be overly viable, and there's a lot more complications around it than people thought there would be. So where are we today? What's going on? With all that context that we just gave, you just have an explosion of treatment providers. There's too many providers. There's not enough patients. So everyone's fighting tooth and claw to get in front of patients, to talk to patients, to get patients in their program. That is the reality of today. Again, we have this situation where everyone's in network, everyone's full continuums of care, or they're trying to be. And if you're not, then you're competing with someone that is. So if you try and open an out-of-network provider, if you try to open a program that is only intensive outpatient, it's much easier for a full continuum of care to survive, to attract patients, to get referrals. And so you're fighting an upstream battle in all of these situations. Now where we are is there is a complete lack of differentiation in the space. And this is where everyone struggles to compete. Because everyone's offering a full continuum, because everyone's in network, those were initially the differentiators in the space. Amenities is really no longer a differentiator. The space has professionalized a lot, especially with dual diagnosis. Families know about the black stain. They do their research. They're aware that the industry has this negative element to it. And so they're looking for quality care. And so that's what people care about. They don't care about the swimming pool. They care about, are you going to get myself or my loved one better? And so clinical care is now the differentiator. But when you talk to providers, what are they doing? Pull up any 5 SUD treatment websites, you will see individualized care, evidence-based care, dual diagnosis, and probably something around trauma. All of those elements are going to be on every single website that you go to. You'll probably also see a faith-based track, an LGBTQ track, and a veterans track, or like a healthcare provider track. Almost everyone has these things as well. So how do you differentiate in the space? How do you attract patients to become the go-to provider, the known provider, right? What is the difference between McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's? We can all pretty well articulate that. We know which one we prefer. We know why. That needs to happen within the SUD environment. And that's a quandary for a lot of providers. There's not a lot of innovation in the space. There hasn't been a lot of focus on clinical care models. There hasn't been a lot of focus on outcomes. There's very little outcomes tracking. There's very little in the way of best practices that have been codified in the space. So that creates a challenge, but also creates a massive opportunity. If you want to invest in this space or become a really successful provider today, you have to have a differentiated program. It doesn't matter if you have a veterans track. What do you do servicing veterans that is standout above and beyond what all the competition in your area is doing? How do you serve veterans better? And how do you get better outcomes for veterans than your competitors? That is the question that has to be answered. If we're looking at a more generic treatment program, let's say you're delivering cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy. How do you do that better and prove it through outcomes compared to your competitors in the space? Like actually, if you look at the research, you'll find that like 80% of people, the clinicians or therapists that say they're delivering CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, actually aren't doing it with fidelity. The majority of them are delivering something that academics, researchers, and clinical experts would not consider to be really high quality CBT. So there is absolutely opportunity to deliver better care, but then there's also opportunity to understand a particular patient population, get really good at a kind of care. It doesn't have to be just clinical care models. It can be wraparound services. What kind of follow-ups are being done? Are you guys providing an app that can integrate them with care long-term? Is there stronger linkages and connections to the community so that you can provide kind of multiple levels of care for issues? Because usually people are coming in with physical health issues, mental health issues. You're probably not going to provide all that care on site, but do you have a relationship and a network of care that you're able to refer out to, or that you're able to engage in the patient's treatment? Those things have value. You've seen some innovation around like genetic testing. American Addiction Center's tried that. Other providers have tried that. There's no real strong academic research that there's any connection between genetics and addiction, or particularly outcomes. So that's as of now, it's still a myth that there's value there, and patients figure that out, referral communities figure that out, so that doesn't end up being a strong differentiator. You'll see some providers trying wearables. There's things where companies have said, hey, look, if you wear this wristwatch, we'll tell through your heartbeat and the way your arm's swinging that you're likely to relapse, and we're going to reach out to you. Not really strong evidence around that either. These are innovations that providers can bring into from either a marketing perspective or a clinical perspective that may have some value, but we haven't really proven out the use case for those yet. So there's question marks around that, but people are trying some things. So there are different options out there to differentiate is the point, whether it's the use of technology, whether it's the focus on training, on hiring, on curriculum, on clinical delivery systems that allow you to deliver better outcomes. These things allow you to differentiate, and this is where treatment providers need to go today. it's probably the area that we spend the most time with clients, is really understanding their strengths, what they're good at, what the market needs, what their competitors aren't doing well, and then how do we bring in some of these differentiated elements so that that is the communication. So people know why they're going to come to our client or to you as a provider versus the 30 to 40 other choices they have literally within a stone's throw, within driving distance of them. So that's it. That's the market today. That's the evolution of business within SUD. Very massive changes. I mean, the space is radically different than it was 10 years ago. It's definitely radically different than it was 20 years ago. We've seen a lot of different trajectories develop within the space. And a lot of the changes have put a lot of pressure on providers. And so taking business models that were viable, that were highly lucrative, and turn them into unprofitable models that resulted in bankruptcies, that resulted in write-downs for the strategic buyers or the private equity companies that bought them. So hopefully this gives you a context of where the field has been, where it is now, what worked in the past, what doesn't work anymore, what you need to be thinking about to really have a successful model. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me at the contact information on the screen, and I appreciate your time.